Psychic used to be the best type in the entire game, but after a bunch of heavy nerfs, it's fallen off quite a bit. But that got me thinking, what is the best Psychic type Pokemon of all time? Is it a Pokemon from back when Psychic was dominant, or is it something newer which has benefited a lot from power creep? I went through every single Psychic type Pokemon ever released, and looked through each of their results in the official competitive circuit. In the end, I've narrowed it down to 10 Pokemon, which I have sorted into a top 10 list. So let's jump right on in with a fan favorite. Coming in at number 10 is Gardevoir. Gardevoir hasn't been like a super popular Pokemon in competitive play, but it did win the World Championships one time, and its Mega form also won a national level event. Gardevoir benefited a lot from the additional Fairy typing that it got when Pokemon X and Y were released. Previously, it was just a Psychic type. Psychic and Fairy isn't like the best type combination because neither of the types can hit Steel types, but it's also not the worst, especially because Fairy is the best type in the game, so most Pokemon benefit from just getting the Fairy typing added to them. When Gardevoir won the World Championships, it was used as actually this kind of fast and frail special attacker. It was holding the Choice Scarf, which boosted speed by 50%, and this made it a really good counter to the various Dragon types, which were, I would say, dominating the metagame. Pokemon like Garchomp and Salamence were popular, and Gardevoir with the Choice Scarf could outspeed them and knock them out in a single hit. This worked especially well because the winning team also had access to Gothitelle, a Pokemon that prevents the opponent from switching out. So if you ever positioned correctly, you could trap the opposing Dragon type in and just knock them out before they could move. When Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire released, Mega Gardevoir was released, and it played a bit differently. Whereas base Gardevoir was fast and frail, Mega Gardevoir could be a little bit more flexible. Because it became a lot bulkier thanks to the extra stats that Mega Evolution gave, it wasn't forced to always all in on offense, though you did have that option. Many players did just choose to max out Mega Gardevoir's speed and special attack stats, but others still actually chose to use it in a much more bulky fashion, relying on the move Trick Room to give the team some speed control. Trick Room causes all slow Pokemon to move before faster ones, and so it's a really great way against a fast and frail team to just rip control of the battle away from them. The main reason to use Mega Gardevoir has to do with its ability, Pixelate. Pixelate turns all normal type moves into Fairy type moves and also gives them a damage boost. This meant that Mega Gardevoir could use the strong normal type move Hyper Voice, which hits both opponents, as a Fairy type move and also made it even stronger. It wasn't a Pokemon that you normally relied on for one-hit KOs, but it was good at just consistently hitting both of your opponent's Pokemon for lots of damage, and if you ignored it, it would wear down your team very, very quickly. Mega Gardevoir almost always used Protect, a Psychic move, and Hyper Voice, but the last move varied quite a bit. I mean, I've already talked about Trick Room, but others still tried to use Calm Mind as a setup move. Some other ones used Imprison. I actually won a regional with Imprison Mega Gardevoir, which would serve as a counter to opposing Mega Gardevoir. And of course, you could always run another attacking move as well, even if it was a little bit less popular, like Thunderbolt or Energy Ball. Mega Gardevoir was never like a top tier Mega Evolution, but it was always respectable. Many players found success using it, and it was always a Pokemon that you really needed to keep in mind and make sure that your team wasn't super weak to. Neither Gardevoir nor Mega Gardevoir have incredible results, but they each were good at a specific moment in time, and I think that warrants them a place on this list. Coming in at number 9 is a newer addition to the game, a Pokemon added in Sword and Shield, Indeedee. Now, Indeedee's funny because it technically has two forms. The male and female form not only have appearance differences, but they also have both stat and move differences as well, and it causes them to actually play like two distinct Pokemon. Neither Indeedee form has many tournament wins. I believe each of them has only won one regional level championship. However, Indeedee female especially has been used so much that it definitely still deserves a spot on this list. Both Indeedees have access to the ability Psychic Surge, which is a very, very good ability. Basically, Psychic Surge sets up the Psychic Terrain, which does a couple things. First, it prevents all moves that have increased priority from hitting any Pokemon that's touching the ground, basically not flying types or levitating Pokemon. Now, priority moves are very common in competitive play, the move Fake Out being probably the most used one, but other moves like Aqua Jet or Extreme Speed, or there's a couple other ones as well, also used pretty frequently. Psychic Terrain means all of these moves will not work, which is a pretty big deal. On top of just blocking priority, Psychic Terrain also powers up all Psychic type attacks, and one Psychic type attack in particular really benefits from it. Expanding Force is also a newer move added in the DLC of Sword and Shield, and it's a Psychic type move that not only gets stronger in Psychic Terrain, but also hits both of your opponent's Pokemon. Spread moves that hit multiple targets are very, very strong, and a spread move that does this much damage and is boosted by Psychic Terrain as much as it is very dangerous. So much much so that many teams build their entire strategy around expanding force. Psychic terrain is also useful as a counter terrain. Sometimes other strategies will be built around grassy or electric or sometimes even misty terrain, and being able to turn those off with your own terrain is pretty valuable. Of course, psychic terrain is not the only reason to use Indeedee. The female Indeedee is much bulkier and gets access to one of the most broken moves in the game, Follow Me. Follow Me does nothing in single battles, but in double battles, it forces both your opponent's Pokemon to target the user. This basically allows a frail offensive Pokemon to be protected by your bulkier support Pokemon, allowing them to attack many more times. Now, one of the main counters to Follow Me is the move Fake Out, which moves before Follow Me can act and allows you to punish the opponent the turn that they go for it. But again, Fake Out is stopped by Psychic Terrain, meaning Indeedee is a great user of this. Indeedee Female can also use the move Helping Hand to boost its partner's damage output even more. I think Indeedee Male also gets that move, but it rarely uses it. What's funny about Indeedee Female is that it accidentally received a pretty major buff in Scarlet and Violet. Basically, Indeedee Female was not supposed to be able to learn the move Trick Room, but when the games first released, there was a Terra raid that allowed female Indeedee to get access to the move Trick Room when it couldn't normally learn it. This put Game Freak in a tough position where there were legally obtained Pokemon with moves that they aren't supposed to learn, and so rather than telling players that Pokemon that they had caught via only in-game methods were not allowed to be used, they just updated Indeedee Female's moveset and allowed it to learn Trick Room via TM. This is a pretty massive buff because whereas before you would need to rely entirely on Indeedee Female's partners to set up Trick Room, now Indeedee Female could do it itself. Indeedee Male has seen a lot less usage, in large part because it's so much less bulky. That being said, it actually gets expanding force, so it functions much more as an offensive Pokemon, normally being used with a Focus Sash or even a Choice Scarf to attack before the opponent can and do huge damage. Indeedee Female is used on both Trick Room and non-Trick Room teams, whereas Indeedee Male is typically used on more hyper-aggressive teams that want to do damage and don't want to deal with Fake Out slowing them down or allowing the opponent to freely reposition. Because Indeedee Male gets the combination of both Imprison and Trick Room, it's really used on these teams not only to provide Psychic Terrain support, but also as a counter to opposing Trick Room teams, which typically serve as a hard counter to these offensive teams if they can ever get it up. Indeedee Male won its first regional championship a couple weeks ago when it was paired with Sneasler and several other offensive Pokemon like Ursaluna Blood Moon. I suspect that going forward, Indeedee Female will be the more popular of the two, but I'm sure Indeedee Male will continue to see some usage. Anyway, number 8. Bronzong. Bronzong's a personal favorite Pokemon of mine because it was on my World Championship winning team, and actually that year that I won Worlds was the year where Bronzong was by far the best that it's ever been. Basically the reason is that back then, the best Pokemon in the game was Xerneas, a legendary Pokemon that was able to double 3 of its most important stats and then just run away with the game. Xerneas was so powerful that after setting up, it could basically 2-hit KO any Pokemon in the game, including Pokemon that resisted it. But Bronzong was one of the few Pokemon that could not only survive a hit from Xerneas, but could actually do something back. Bronzong could set Trick Room up to punish the fact that Xerneas was doubling its speed stat, and as a Steel-type physical attacker, it could not only hit Xerneas for super effective damage, but it could hit it on the side where it was most vulnerable, the physical defense side, which is the one stat that Xerneas wasn't doubling. Bronzong also has access to the move Gyro Ball, which does more damage the slower the user is compared to the target, and since Xerneas was doubling its speed, this almost always resulted in the maximum base power possible for Gyro Ball. On top of just being so good into Xerneas though, Bronzong could also support its team with a number of great support moves. Like many Pokemon on this list as a Psychic type, it could use the move Trick Room, but it also has other options as well. Skill Swap was really useful because if you used it on your Primal Groudon, it became immune to the opposing Primal Groudon's ground type moves, and if you used it on your Primal Kyogre, you could also become immune to Primal Groudon. Using Skill Swap on one of the Primal Pokemon would reset their very important weather without forcing them to switch out, and so it was also useful even when you didn't need to worry about ground type attacks. Bronzong could use the attack Gravity, which was very dangerous when paired with Primal Groudon, as it allowed Precipice Blades to not only never miss, but also hit all flying and levitating Pokemon, which are normally the only Pokemon that can be immune to Precipice Blades. And Gravity also benefited Bronzong as it could use the move Hypnosis to put opponents to sleep. And in Gravity, because it raises accuracy, Hypnosis never misses. My Bronzong that won the World Championships used Trick Room, Gyro Ball, Skill Swap, and Safeguard. Back then, Dark Void Smeargle was totally running away with the game, and Safeguard protected the entire team from falling asleep for 5 turns. I suspect that Bronzong might have seen a little bit of play during Sword and Shield, if not for the pandemic canceling all events, as back then one of the strongest Pokemon in the game was Rhyperior, and Bronzong has one of the best matchups against it. Even still, Bronzong continues to pop up every now and then, but it hasn't seen that same level of dominance that it did in 2016 for quite some time. That being said, it was such a good Pokemon in 2016 and it won the World Championships that I think it's totally fair to put it on this list in the number 8 slot. Coming in at number 7 is Latios. Latios won the World Championships back during Black and White, and it also has at least one national win. I say at least one because I feel like it probably has more given how good good it was, but some of the records that keep track of these things are like not fully updated, so it's hard to say for sure. Latios was the Pokemon that defined the final 2 years of Black and White, including Black and White 2. Back in Black and White, the new mechanic was something called gems. There was one for every type, and the way that they worked was they would provide a one-time boost to a move that matched the type. So the Psychic Gem would power up Psychic type moves, the Dragon Gem Dragon type moves, and this would only happen if the move successfully hit the target. So if you attacked into a Protect, your gem wouldn't be wasted. These gems boosted a move by a whopping 50%, which is basically the most that any item can provide. Now, what you have to keep in mind is that back in Generation 4, dragons were generally the best type in the game. Dragons have, in part because of how dominant they were in Black and White and Black and White 2, been nerfed pretty heavily. But back then, this was pre-nerfs. Draco Meteor was stronger, there was no fairy type Pokemon, and overall the game was just a lot slower, and so Latios was basically one of the fastest Pokemon out there. Latios, Dragon Gem, Draco Meteor completely took over the game. Every Pokemon on every team had to keep it in mind when they were building, whether they could survive it or whether they had to switch into something else. The only type in the game that could even resist it was Steel types, and most teams only had one of those, and even then, Steel types were often taking over 50% of their health to Draco Meteor. Latios also had decent enough natural bulk that it was hard to knock it out before it could attack. Even if you had a priority move like Sucker Punch, Latios would often survive. Latios was so strong that even after dominating the format for almost the entirety of the 2 years that it was legal in Black and White, it still won the World Championships. Of course, after this point, Fairy Pokemon were introduced the following generation in X and Y, and Dragon usage across the board dropped, especially Latios, who basically dropped to 0 usage, and we thought that was the end of Latios, but then last year it had a total resurgence and actually won a regional. Now, this was kind of a flash in the pan, and I think more a response to the specific Pokemon that were popular at that moment in time, rather than actually being, one of the best Pokemon again, but it's still very impressive. Some of you are probably wondering about Mega Latios, who I guess is kind of a buff going into X and Y, but Mega Latios was so bad that it doesn't have any competitive results at all, so I'm not mentioning it beyond this. That being said, regular Latios was so good that it's definitely one of the best Psychic type Pokemon of all time. Many of you probably know that this video is part of a series where I've talked about many of the best Pokemon of different types. If you're enjoying it, you should make sure that you subscribe so that you don't miss future uploads where I talk about different types. There's still a fair few I haven't talked about yet, so if you're enjoying this and you want to see more of it, subscribing not only helps the channel and all the people who work on it, but it also tells YouTube you want to see more of my content. So if you're liking this, you should do it. I feel like I have to stop pointing. Okay, this next one's going to come as a bit of a surprise, I suspect, because it's a Pokemon that was definitely one of the best Pokemon for, some of the early years of a competitive play, but the number 6 slot on our list is Metagross. Metagross has 1 World Championship wins, 3 national wins not factoring in its Mega Evolution, and 2 national wins with its Mega Evolution. The Mega Evolution also has 2 World Semi-Final appearances. During Black and White, Metagross is one of the best Pokemon, period. Part of the reason for this is that the Steel type still resisted Ghost and Dark, so Metagross was only weak to Fire and Ground type moves. Overall, the Pokemon were a lot slower back then because this was before we had pretty ridiculous power creep, and so Metagross actually ended up at a pretty nice speed tier where you could use it in both Tailwind and Trick Room without needing to invest that many points in its speed. It has a very useful ability called Clear Body that prevents the opponent from lowering its stats, which is a big deal as Intimidate is often used to slow down physical attackers. Metagross had both good bulk and a high attack stat for the time, and combining that with its great defensive and decent offensive typing made it difficult to remove while still allowing it to do damage every single turn. There was a couple different ways of using Metagross. One of the more popular ones is a strategy that has been kind of lost to time. You would give Metagross a Lumberry, which cures all status conditions, and then you would use Swagger on it, like your own Pokemon would use Swagger, which doubles the target's attack stat and confuses them, but the Lumberry would remove the confusion. Since you couldn't lower Metagross's attack after this point, and because the Swagger user was normally Cresselia, who could control the speed of the battle, this was very dangerous. It wasn't the only way that players used Metagross though. Some players used Choice Band, often even using Explosion, and Choice Band Explosion could often just delete entire teams, and there were some other strategies that popped up as well. Going into X and Y, Metagross was nerfed. The biggest thing was the fact that Steel would no longer resist Dark and Ghost, but also Meteor Mash was nerfed as well, and so players tended to have a much harder time using regular Metagross, though it did pop up every once in a while. Now, in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, Mega Metagross was introduced, and this was definitely a good Mega Evolution. It changed the way that Metagross played pretty dramatically. Instead of being this kind of bulky, tanky Pokemon that worked both in Trick Room or outside of Trick Room, it turned Metagross into a fast and powerful attacker that was really good into Fairy types in particular. Now, it was never the strongest Mega Evolution, but it was always a very good one. I would put it in the A or the B tier at pretty much all points. Mega Metagross got the Tough Claws ability, which boosted some of its moves even further, and it could still take advantage of Clear Body because switches happened before Mega Evolution did, so your opponent couldn't switch in and intimidate user until after you Mega Evolved, giving Mega Metagross an edge. Mega Metagross was not considered a better Mega Evolution in large part just because the other Mega Evolutions were kind of broken, like Mega Kangaskhan, Mega Salamence, Mega Charizard, Mega Gengar. All these Pokemon had some kind of game-breaking advantage, whereas Mega Metagross was just a really good regular Pokemon, but both Metagross forms had their moments and performed really well at times. The only reason that Metagross isn't higher on this list is because I think the Pokemon above it are all more dominant, but it is still undoubtedly one of the best Psychic-type Pokemon of all time. Coming in at number 5 is Tapu Lele, a Pokemon introduced as one of the 4 Tapu Pokemon in Sun and Moon. Now, Tapu Lele's never won the World Championships, but it did place second at Worlds twice. It also has 6 national level event wins, and all of this is considering that it's not even in Scarlet and Violet. Like I said, Tapu Lele is one of the 4 Tapu Pokemon, and it's the one with the most focus on offense. Just like Gardevoir, Fairy is a good secondary type because it gives it access to some very powerful move, and Fairy in general is kind of just like a better type than Psychic, or a better version of the Psychic type, so it's certainly not bad. Tapu Lele could be used in a couple different ways. Back in Sun and Moon, it had access to Z moves, and Z Psychic was kind of the equivalent of that generation's Dragon Gem Draco Meteor, although it did have worse offensive typing. The thing is that if you didn't resist Z Psychic from Tapu Lele, it would KO pretty much anything that it hit. Another way of getting more damage in your Tapu Lele was to use the Choice Specs, which allowed Tapu Lele to have multiple huge attacks, though none of them quite as powerful as Z Psychic. The advantage of using Choice Specs is that it allowed you to train your Tapu Lele with much more of a focus and bulk, because your item was providing so much power. Other items saw play as well. Life Orb was a decently popular one, and Choice Scarf had a funny interaction with Xerneas where you could run Choice Scarf Tapu Lele, and you could use the move Magic Room, which temporarily turns off all items for 5 turns, so you would use Tapu Lele, send it out, it would outspeed Xerneas, you would Magic Room to turn off the Xerneas' Power Herb, it would go for Geomancy, which normally uses the Power Herb to turn a 2-turn move into a 1-turn move, but because you turned off the items, they no longer would be able to do that, and then Tapu Lele could switch moves because Magic Room had also turned off its own Choice Scarf. If that didn't make any sense, don't worry about it. It's just a funny interaction that I think is cool. Oh yeah, just like Indeedee, Tapu Lele also has access to the Psychic Surge ability, setting up the Psychic Terrain. Actually, Tapu Lele was the original Pokemon with this ability, so there was a time where it was the only way to get Psychic Terrain on your team. Thankfully, Tapu Lele does not get access to Expanding Force. That would have been a problem. The difference between these two Pokemon, though, is that whereas Indeedee Female is much more of a supportive Psychic Terrain setter, Tapu Lele is much more of an offensive one, but unlike Indeedee Male, who's so frail, Tapu Lele actually has decent bulk, and so it often will stick around for at least one attack. Indeedee Female often enables a stronger, more offensive partner, and Tapu Lele can do this as well, but the thing is, Tapu Lele does this while also threatening offense of its own. When it was legal, Tapu Lele was often paired with Ultra Necrozma, who could do immense amounts of damage with its signature Z move, which I don't know if we're allowed to show, it might copyright claim the video, but regardless, these two were a really scary offensive pairing. Tapu Lele also enabled some more niche Pokemon that otherwise wouldn't see play, most specifically Pokemon with the Unburden ability, which doubles their speed stats whenever they use their held item. Pokemon like Drifblim and Excelgor really enjoyed being paired with Tapu Lele because they both have the Unburden ability, and they could use the Psychic Seed item, which activates when Psychic Terrain is active to give them a special defense boost, which would in turn activate Unburden, doubling their speed stats. Both these Pokemon won tournaments when paired with Tapu Lele, and they otherwise likely wouldn't have seen much play. This is kind of the reverse of Indeedee, where Indeedee is a defensive Pokemon that enables an offensive attacker, and Tapu Lele is an offensive Pokemon that enables a defensive support Pokemon. Anyway, Tapu Lele is certainly one of the best Psychic type Pokemon of all time, and I'm sure it will continue to put up results if it ever is added back to future games. Coming in at number 4 is a Pokemon that people I think are going to be surprised by, but I looked through all the numbers, I looked through all the results, and it's absolutely fair. The number 4 slot in our list is Gothitelle. People might think I'm biased because Gothitelle is one of my all-time favorite Pokemon, but hear me out. Gothitelle has won the World Championships twice, one of which was before it had access to its most broken tool. Gothitelle's used mostly because it has access to one of the best abilities in the game, Shadow Tag. Shadow Tag prevents the opponent from switching out for as long as the user is on the field, and it doesn't work on Ghost type Pokemon. Trapping the opponent on the field means you don't have to worry about another Pokemon switching in. It simplifies the game dramatically by stripping away your opponent's options. You can use Shadow Tag both offensively to trap something in that your partner Pokemon can KO, or defensively to trap a Pokemon in that has its stats lowered or is otherwise bad at doing damage. Gothitelle has a number of good supporting moves like Trick Room, Heal Pulse, Repulse, Charm, and Tickle. Tickle might sound a little funny because it's, it seems just like a joke move. But back in X and Y, it was actually one of the main things that Gothitelle did. Being able to lower the opponent's attack stat was good, but being able to lower their defense stat to combo with Mega Mawile, who also lowered their attack stat with the Intimidate ability before it Mega evolved, was a really dangerous duo. Gothitelle was already a great Pokemon, but in Sword and Shield, it received a buff that didn't end up mattering actually until Scarlet and Violet. It got access to the move Fake Out, which is one of the most powerful moves in the entire game. It wasn't as good during Sword and Shield because Dynamax Pokemon couldn't flinch, and Fake Out, you only really use it because you want to flinch the opponent. That being said, in Scarlet and Violet, Dynamax was removed, and so Gothitelle saw a major resurgence. Its usage was never so high, but the results that it was picking up was insane. Gothitelle had one of the best runs of any Pokemon without super high usage during Scarlet and Violet, and actually most recently, I just won another regional championship with it, which I believe is my third one ever, in a format where I was the only person to even top cut with Gothitelle. It's a Pokemon that can always pop up regardless of the power level of the format because of how good Shadow Tag is on a bulky Pokemon. And I'm sure that as long as it's in future games, we will continue to see it going forward. Okay, before we talk about the top 3, let's do some quick honorable mentions. First, Executor. Executor is one of my all-time favorite Pokemon, and I want to mention it here because I got second with it at the World Championships in 2012 during the second year of Black and White. We also saw Executor pop up a little bit in the most recent format as an attacker actually that could both set Trick Room and take advantage of the sun with its Chlorophyll ability, actually using Expanding Force on a Trick Room Psychic Terrain based team. Next, Farigiraf. I really wanted to put Farigiraf on this list, but I just couldn't given how good the Pokemon on here are and how many results that they have. But it was a Pokemon that I really wanted to include. It's really good, and I think if I made this video by the time Scarlet and Violet is over, it would have earned its spot. But as things stand right now, not yet. Hatterene. It felt kind of bad to leave Hatterene off this list because, it's kind of one of the quintessential Expanding Force Pokemon. It's the Pokemon that I think of when I think of Expanding Force, but it just doesn't have as good results as any of the Pokemon on this list. Most of the Pokemon here either have a really high level of dominance or a really good finish at the World Championships. Hatterene has neither, so I had to leave it off. But yeah, it's another Psychic Fairy type Pokemon that is a very good Trick Room attacker that I think is one of the best Psychic types of all time, just not one of the top 10 ones. And then in terms of power, the strongest Pokemon that I left off was Necrozma, specifically Ultra Necrozma. This Pokemon was only ever legal for 1 year, but it did get second at the World Championships during that year. Light That Burns My Eyes is just a really powerful signature Z move, and it's definitely a really good Pokemon, and Psychic Dragon is really cool typing. However, because it was only legal one time and it was never the most dominant Pokemon in the format, I didn't think that I could put it here. Oh, and some of you were probably wondering about Mewtwo, but I've mentioned this before, I guess I'll just say it again. In competitive play in the official competitive format, Mewtwo just can't really keep up. It has basically no results. Even if this were a top 15 list, I still couldn't have included Mewtwo. Okay, time for the top 3. The number 3 best Psychic type Pokemon on my list is Lunala. Lunala has won the World Championships 1 time. It's also gotten second at the World Championship 1 time, and it's won 2 national level events. What you have to keep in mind about Lunala is that it's only ever been legal for 3 different years, so to get World's first and World's second is very impressive. Lunala is a very bulky Pokemon who is kind of a jack of all trades. It can support its team with moves like Trick Room, Tailwind, and Wide Guard. It can do damage with Moongeist Beam. It can set up with Meteor Beam or Calm Mind, and it can heal itself with Moonlight. The main issue with Lunala is that you can only pick 4 moves when often you'd prefer to have 10. Its ability is Shadow Shield, which is an amazing ability that halves all damage when it still has full HP. Combining this with how bulky Lunala is makes it virtually impossible to knock out in one hit if it still has full HP. I mentioned Meteor Beam a second ago, but Lunala actually won the World Championships when it didn't have access to this move, which is pretty surprising because Ghost and Psychic typing is not very good, and the year that Lunala won Worlds was a year where Incineroar was incredibly dominant. Lunala is a restricted Pokemon, which means that not only is it rarely legal, but when it is, you can only have 1 or 2 of them on your team. And using your restricted slot for a Pokemon that loses super hard to Incineroar and can't really do much back seems a little bit risky, but it paid off, and Lunala won the World Championships despite Incineroar's dominance. Nowadays, Lunala has a much better matchup against Incineroar because, again, I got access to Meteor Beam, which is a 2-turn move that you can make 1 turn with Power Herb that powers up the user as a Rock-type move and can KO most Incineroar in 1 hit, but clearly Lunala doesn't need it because it won Worlds without it. Now, I will say, despite Lunala's very impressive finishes, it was actually very bad the most recent time that it was legal, and that's in part because the most recent format, called Regulation G, only allowed 1 restricted Pokemon, whereas all prior restricted formats allowed 2. And I think the thing about Lunala is that it's really good as a restricted Pokemon that is not your primary one. Like, you normally want at least one restricted Pokemon that's going to do crazy amounts of damage, like Groudon or Kyogre or Zacian. But Lunala really excelled at kind of sitting on the field, being bulky, doing good damage over time, like being hard to remove, which is less valuable when your opponent is hitting you with moves like Water Spout or Precipice Blades or some of the more powerful ones, like, you know, even Xerneas's moves, right? Something that I'm personally very curious about is how Lunala will perform when 2 restricted Pokemon are allowed in Scarlet and Violet. One of its main weaknesses is its typing, being quadruple weak to both Ghost and Dark, and with Terastallization, Lunala can get around this. Now, again, as a single restricted Pokemon, it wasn't good enough, but as a double restricted Pokemon, I think we could see more good stuff from Lunala. Until then, though, it's earning the number 3 slot on my list. The number 2 slot on my list is, I'm cheating a little bit. I'm putting 2 Pokemon at the number 2 slot because they have the same name. It's Calyrex Ice and Calyrex Shadow. Calyrex Shadow has won the World Championships, and Calyrex Ice got 2nd place one time. Keep in mind, these Pokemon have only been legal for 2 World Championships. Also, each Calyrex won the North American International Championships once. The reason I'm putting these 2 together is because it would feel really weird to split them up, at least to me personally, because they have so much in common, and because they have similar levels of results, even though it's not identical. Both Calyrex have a couple things in common. They're both Psychic type, and their ability is basically just a reskin of the same thing. This ability is called As One, and it not only prevents the opponent from eating any berries as long as Calyrex is on the field, but it also powers up Calyrex's highest attacking stat every single time it gets a KO. This can very quickly lead to games getting out of hand, because if Calyrex gets 1 KO, it's easier to get future KOs, etc, etc. They also each have a signature move that never misses, does huge damage, and hits both opponents. Glacial Lance and Astral Barrage are 2 of the most powerful moves ever made, and whereas normally moves this strong have some kind of real drawback, these moves just don't. Calyrex Shadow typically is used as a setup sweeper with the attack Nasty Plot, which doubles its special attack, and it has worse typing and worse bulk than Ice Rider, but it is much faster, which is a huge edge. Conversely, Ice Rider is way tankier, but it's also way slower, and it often relies on Trick Room to move first, which is okay because it can set it up for itself. Ice Rider has better coverage moves, whereas Shadow Rider suffers because the overlap between Psychic and Ghost is awkward. But Shadow Rider is the single fastest restricted Pokemon, which gives it an edge against almost every other restricted Pokemon just from the get-go. To me, these are the modern day Xerneases. The only reason that they don't win more events is because they are so good that they have such a big target on their backs. Shadow Rider in particular is a bit easier to counter than Ice Rider because any Dark type is immune to Psychic type attacks and resists Ghost, and is often able to KO Calyrex in a single hit back. There's also specific type combinations that give Shadow Rider trouble, like how Farigiraf is immune to Ghost and resists Psychic. That being said, it is really difficult to shut down these Pokemon completely, and even if you built your team with them in mind, you might still lose. Which just leaves the number 1 best Psychic type Pokemon of all time. It's not Terra Psychic Incineroar, it's actually Cresselia. Cresselia is the only Psychic type Pokemon to have won the World Championships 3 different times. It is the most dominant Pokemon of Black and White. It was extremely good during X and Y, and despite falling off in later years, it saw a resurgence in Scarlet and Violet. Cresselia was basically the bulkiest Pokemon that players used for many years, which is a problem because Cresselia has one of the best move pools of any Psychic type Pokemon. It can control the speed of the battle with Trick Room, Icy Wind, or Thunder Wave. It can boost its partner with Helping Hand. It can do damage itself with Ice Beam and Psychic and Psyshock. I've even won a tournament with Hidden Power Fire Cresselia, and there are so many other support moves it gets as well, like Safeguard and Swagger, like I mentioned with Metagross. Some players even ran more offensive items like Choice Specs or Expert Belt, taking advantage of the fact that it's naturally so bulky that you could train it very heavily in its offenses without worrying about keeping it alive. Cresselia enabled so many other Pokemon. In years where there weren't great Trick Room setters, Cresselia rose above and beyond to basically enable the entire strategy. It was especially dangerous because Cresselia worked so well in and out of Trick Room. Some players would use both Trick Room and Icy Wind to counter faster teams with Trick Room and middle speed teams with Icy Wind. It is worth noting that Cresselia was so good that it's one of the few legendary Pokemon that's received a nerf, with several of its stats being lowered going into Scarlet and Violet. That being said, Cresselia also received a buff in Legends Arceus, which carried over to Scarlet and Violet with its new signature move, Lunar Blessing, which not only healed itself and its partner by a quarter of their health, but also healed any of their status conditions. This allowed Cresselia to serve as a really hard counter to Amoonguss, who could otherwise put multiple Pokemon to sleep. Cresselia saw a decent bit of play when it was added to Scarlet and Violet, mostly when paired with Ursaluna. Ursaluna really wants to be in Trick Room, and it really wants to use Earthquake as well. Cresselia could set Trick Room and was immune to Earthquake, but that wasn't the only advantage. Lunar Blessing was great with Ursaluna because Ursaluna has to burn itself with the Flame Orb item in order to activate its full power. Burn doing damage over time could really quickly wear down Ursaluna, but Lunar Blessing would not only cure the burn for the turn, but also give Ursaluna some recovery. Flame Orb as an item activates multiple times, and so even though you would cure the burn, you would still end up burned at the end of the turn, basically allowing Ursaluna to skip taking damage for the turn, effectively increasing the healing by another 6%. The more the generations go on and the more powerful the Pokemon get, I suspect the more trouble Cresselia will have keeping up, especially now that it has been nerfed. But it had such a dominant run, and it's one of the only Pokemon to win the World Championships 3 times, whereas no Pokemon has won the World Championships more often, that in my opinion, it is still the best Psychic-type Pokemon of all time. And that's my list. If you like this video, you might like this other one I made on the best Ground-type Pokemon. There are some very powerful Ground types, and there's also some Pokemon on there that you might have forgotten about.